The decree had already been read. She knew this because no one would look at her. That was how she understood it, not from the parchment held in Lord Castellan Draveth's spotted hands, not from the low rumble of the assembled court, not even from the man standing at the dais who had once pressed his forehead to hers in the dark and told her she smelled like home. She understood it from the eyes. Every courtier, every lady, every armored guard along the marble hall had fixed their gaze somewhere. The floor, the high vaulted ceiling, the painted wolves snarling above the throne. Anywhere that was not her face. She was already gone to them. Seraphine Voss, queen consort of the Iron March throne, stood with her hands folded at her waist, and her spine so straight it ached, and she watched her husband sign the paper that unmade her. He did not look up. That was the thing she would carry longest, not the cold words of the decree, not the courtiers holding their breath like this was entertainment, not the particular cruelty of being dismissed in the same hall where she had been crowned. It was that he did not look up. Aldrich Vane, Alpha King of the 7 Packs, the man who could silence a room with the weight of his stillness, could not find it in himself to meet her eyes while he stripped her title from her body like a skin she'd borrowed and given back. His jaw was set. That muscle in his cheek moved once. Just once. She had learned to read him in the language of small movements. 3 years of marriage had made her fluent in the vocabulary of his restraint. She knew what a clenched jaw meant, knew what the slight flare of his nostrils said when something had disturbed the scent of the room, knew that when his hands went very still, his mind was working furiously. She had catalogued him. She had loved him in the patient, careful way of a woman who understood she was not the kind of love that announces itself. She was the kind that builds quietly, corner by corner, and hopes eventually to become a room someone cannot imagine leaving. She had been wrong about that. The decree of dissolution, Draveth read, his voice carrying its practiced authority through the long hall, is issued on the grounds that the queen consort Seraphine, born of the Voss line of the southern reaches, has demonstrated no wolf form in 3 years of bonded marriage, and has failed to produce evidence of the bond mark's completion. The Iron March throne requires its queen to be wolf-born and wolf-blessed. As the lady in question carries no wolf, she carries no claim. No wolf, no claim. She breathed through it, kept her hands folded, did not let her fingers tremble, though the air in the hall tasted like old stone, and the particular copper-sharp scent of a crowd holding its collective breath. Someone near the back, one of the younger lords, she thought, from the direction, made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. Aldrich's pen scratched once across the parchment. Done. You will be conveyed to the Ashenmere estate, Draveth continued, rolling the document with practiced efficiency. On the western marches, effective at dawn. A stipend of modest provision will accompany you. The court thanks you for your service to the Iron March line. The court thanks you. As if she had been a kitchen girl who'd done well at the washing. She unclenched her jaw, took one breath. Then she turned and walked, did not shuffle, did not hurry, walked, with the straight back and deliberate pace of a woman who had decided that whatever else they took from her, they would not take this. Down the center of the hall, between the rows of averted eyes, past the stone wolves and the great iron doors, out into the cold corridor beyond. She counted 17 steps before she heard the doors close behind her. 16 before she allowed herself to press one hand, briefly, against the wall. 1 before her lady-in-waiting found her. I'm here, Marin said. Just that. Nothing else. Marin Alsha was small and dark-haired and possessed of a frankness that had gotten her dismissed from 2 noble households before Seraphine had taken her on. partly out of mercy and partly because she'd recognized in Marin a quality she admired and could not name until now. The quality of a person who would rather say the true thing badly than the false thing beautifully. She pressed close against Seraphine's side in the corridor, and she smelled of ink and dried herbs and the particular nervous sweet scent of a person containing grief on someone else's behalf. "Don't," Seraphine said. "I'm not saying anything." "You're about to." Marin was quiet for 2 seconds. "He didn't even—" "I know." "Sarah, I know." She straightened away from the wall, rolled her shoulder, arranged the fall of her gown with hands that were, she was pleased to discover, entirely steady. "We have until dawn. Go pack what matters. Leave everything they gave us." Marin looked at her for a moment with the expression she always wore when she was deciding whether to push. Then she pressed her mouth together and nodded, and the small gold ring through her left ear, the one she never explained, the one she'd worn since before Seraphine had known her, caught the corridor light and flashed once like a signal. "Everything?" she asked. Seraphine thought of the carved rosewood jewelry box on her dressing table, a gift from Aldrich in the first year. Thought of the wolf fur throw he'd draped over her shoulders one winter evening when he'd thought she was cold and hadn't wanted to say so. Thought of the half-written letter she'd never sent him, still folded in the lining of her green riding coat. "Everything," she said. The carriage was not the Queen's carriage. That was the first small precision of her undoing. The Queen's carriage was black lacquered wood and ironwood wheels, and cushioned in deep burgundy, and it bore the wolf and crown seal. This carriage was older, brown with road dust, the cushions faded to a color that could not decide between gray and green. It smelled of must and old leather, and beneath that, faintly, the ghost of someone else's journey. She and Marin rode in silence for the first hour. The road west of the capital narrowed almost immediately, as if the land itself had agreed to make this departure feel like a contraction, a shrinking. The great pine forests of the Iron March pressed close from both sides, dark and enormous, full of the sounds that deep old woodland makes at the edge of winter, the creak of branches, the distant percussion of something large moving through undergrowth, the very occasional mournful note of an unseen bird. Wind came through the carriage's ill-fitted window frame in thin, cold threads. Seraphine watched the trees. She had grown up in the southern reaches, far from forests like these. Her father's land had been grassland and limestone hills and the wide salt flats that bloomed pink in summer, with a flower no one had named yet because no one had thought to bother. She had arrived at the Iron March capital at 19, called to court for the traditional assembly of potential mates for the newly crowned Alpha King, and she had spent the first week feeling compressed by the weight and density of the north. The buildings too tall, the trees too close, the people too layered in their intentions. She had not expected to stay, had not expected him to choose her, when there were wolf women of every prestigious bloodline assembled, women who could shift and run and fill the bond with the bright animal warmth the Iron March required. She had carried no wolf. She'd always known it. Had been tested at 12, at 14, at 16, and each test had returned the same quiet result. Present but dormant, the examiners had said, like a word everyone agreed not to use. He had chosen her anyway, and she had never quite understood why, and had been too careful of it to ask. The carriage hit a rut. Marin grabbed the hanging strap. Seraphine braced her hand on the door. "What's Ashenmere?" Marin asked, when the road smoothed again. "An estate. Old. On the western marches, near the border of what used to be the Crestfall territory before it was absorbed. It's been empty for, I don't know, decades." She had looked it up, 2 weeks ago, when the rumors had first reached her with enough weight to feel like more than rumors. She had sat in the palace library and found Ashenmere in 3 different histories, each of which described it using words that fell into 2 categories: ancient and abandoned. One text had called it something else. She had read the phrase twice and then smoothed the page with her palm as if pressing it down. It was important once. Important how? She looked out the window. A raven crossed the gap between 2 pines, black against the leaden sky. I'm not sure yet. That was not entirely true, but there were things Seraphine kept, not from deception but from a superstition she had never been able to name. The sense that speaking a hope aloud before it had solidified was a way of destroying it. She had carried too many things in silence. Perhaps that was a flaw. Marin would say so, had said so, gently and not so gently. But silence had also protected her in rooms where words were weapons, and she was not ready to disarm. Outside, the trees thickened. The road became a track. She thought of him. Couldn't help it, even now, not the Aldrich of the decree, not the jaw-set, eyes-averted man at the dais, but an older image, one she'd built up over 3 years from fragments. The way he stood at a window with his hands behind his back, and his shoulders carrying the weight of something he'd never explain. The way he smelled after council meetings, iron and tension, and underneath it, muffled and almost hidden, something sweeter than his usual pine and cold mountain scent that she had never been able to identify and had spent 3 years wanting to. The one time, just once, when he had laughed, really laughed. The kind that bent him forward slightly, and that he'd cut off so fast she'd almost doubted it. And the scent that had come off him in that half-second before he'd reassembled himself had been like warm rain on dry earth, and she'd thought, there it is. That's who he is under all of it. She pressed that image flat, put it somewhere low and quiet. She would not be spending the Western marches in mourning for a man who had signed her away without meeting her eyes. She would not. Ashenmere appeared at dusk on the 3rd day. It was worse than she'd imagined and better than she'd feared, which was a description she'd heard someone use once about grief and thought applied here well enough. The main house was stone, old gray stone the color of winter sky, 3 stories with a 4th partially collapsed at the east wing. Ivy had taken the western face entirely, dark and thick and winter bare now, the skeleton of it making lace patterns against the stone. The drive was overgrown. The gateposts were cracked. One still held a carved wolf's head, proud and intact. The other had lost its head at some point and stood blunt and resigned. The carriage stopped. Marin looked at it, then looked at Seraphine. It has walls, Seraphine said. Most of them. And a roof. Structurally. Seraphine opened the door herself. The footman provided by the court had the look of a man who intended to do the minimum, and stepped down onto the overgrown gravel. Cold met her at once, the specific wet cold of a place that sits near water, and she could hear just below the wind the low voice of a river somewhere unseen. The air smelled of damp stone and leaf mold and something else, something she couldn't quite place, green and deep and old in a way that bypassed the nose and settled somewhere lower. Not in the chest, not in the throat, but somewhere in the architecture of her bones. She stood still for a moment with her face turned slightly into the wind. The land knows you. That was the phrase she'd read in the library, in the history she'd smoothed flat. She'd found it in a section about the Western marches, about the old territories. It was attributed to no one in particular, the way old truths often aren't, as if the statement had simply arrived and everyone had agreed to keep it. She hadn't let herself think about what it might mean for someone like her, someone without a wolf. Your Majesty. She turned. A man had come around from the side of the house, moving with a careful sideways gait, favoring his left hip. He was old. Not just aged, but old in the way that certain things become more themselves with time rather than less. His face carved deeply by weather and expression both. His white hair long enough to be pulled back with a piece of leather cord. He wore a coat that had once been wool and was now something more complicated, repaired with several different materials over what must have been decades. In his left hand he held a gardening tool, a small curved blade for clearing brush, and his right hand he extended toward her with the particular courtesy of a person who had once known protocol and had since decided that warmth was more important. "Brennan Ashwood," he said. "Caretaker." She took his hand. His grip was dry and sure. "Seraphine." He looked at her with eyes so pale they were almost colorless, the kind of eyes that made you feel they were seeing farther than your face. He did not call her your former majesty, or ma'am, or the other careful diminutions she'd been bracing for. He simply nodded once, as if something he'd expected had arrived, and said, "The house is cold, but the kitchen fire is lit. Come inside." Marin appeared at her elbow with their 2 bags. The footman had already turned the carriage around. They went inside. The kitchen was the best room. Brennan seemed to know this without needing to be told. He led them directly past the entry hall with its sheeted furniture and the dining room with its broken chandelier, and brought them to a large, low-ceilinged room in the back of the house, where a fire in a stone hearth the size of a doorway had been burning long enough to mean it. There was a rough-hewn table, chairs that didn't match, a cast-iron pot hanging above the fire smelling of something herbed and warming. Seraphine sat down and felt something she hadn't expected, the particular relief of not having to perform. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Brennan set bowls on the table with the ease of a man who had set bowls on this table thousands of times. "Longer than you've been alive. And before me? Did you have guests?" He looked at her with those pale eyes, a small thing moving behind them. "No one has been sent here in a very long time." "Sent," Marin said. "That's an interesting word. It's the right one." He filled the bowls, set bread on the table, sat down across from Seraphine. In the firelight, the old scars on his hands were more visible, long, pale lines that crossed each other at the knuckles. Women have been sent to Ashenmere twice before in the history of the Iron March. Both times it was for the same reason. "They had no wolf," Seraphine said. The fire cracked. Marin put down her spoon. "They thought they had no wolf," Brennan said. Silence. Long enough for the fire to crack again, for the wind to push at the kitchen window, for the smell of the soup to move through the room and remind everyone's bodies that they were hungry and alive regardless of what the mind was doing. "What happened to them?" Seraphine asked, carefully, keeping the hope from her voice, the old superstition, the old protection. Brennan wrapped both scarred hands around his bowl. One of them became the most powerful alpha in the history of the Western Marches. She never went back to the capital. She built something here instead. A pause. The other went back. "On whose terms?" Marin asked. For the first time, a smile moved through Brennan's face like light moving through water, present and then gone. Her own. She dreamed of running that first night. Not wolf running, not the 4-pawed, world-blurring speed she'd watched other shifted wolves achieve and felt no envy for. Or so she'd told herself. So often she'd nearly made it true. This was something else. This was her own body, moving through dark trees, and the ground beneath her feet was warm even in winter, and the sound the land made was not wind but breath, deep and slow and in rhythm with her own. She woke to frost on the window glass and the sound of the river below the house, and her heart was hammering in a way she did not know how to account for. She lay still for a moment, one hand flat on her sternum. The light was early gray, and the room smelled of old wood and cold stone and, faintly, that green deep thing she'd noticed outside. Stronger now, as if the house itself was breathing it up through the floors. She dressed quickly in the warmest things she had, and went out before Maren woke. The grounds were larger than she'd realized from the approach. The drive was the formal face, but behind the house the land opened up. A kitchen garden gone wild, an orchard of bare-branched trees, and beyond the orchard a slope down to a river that moved dark and deliberate through the winter morning, carrying the cold of higher ground south with it. On the far bank, forest. Old forest. The kind that has no gap in it, no beginning you can point to. She stood at the river's edge and breathed. The scent that came off the water and the bank was the strongest version yet of the thing she'd been catching. Ancient green, deep earth. Something almost mineral, like stone that had been warmed and cooled 10,000 times, and kept its memory of each. And beneath that, so faint she thought at first she'd invented it, a scent that was hers. Her own scent, but older somehow. Deeper, like finding a photograph of yourself from before you were born. Her hands were at her sides and they were shaking, not from cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through the shake. She would not let herself name what this was yet. She was a careful woman. She had been careful her whole life. Careful in her hopes, careful in her attachments, careful in the way she'd loved a man who'd never quite let her in all the way. Careful was what she had. Careful was survival. But the land breathed under her feet, and she breathed back, and something in the exchange felt like a conversation she'd been trying to start for 23 years. Back at the Capitol. And this is the shift, the clean cut, the moment the narration moves into the head of the man who could not look up. The throne room smelled of burnt paper and old argument. Aldrich Vane stood at the window in his private chambers, which was his customary posture for suffering, and watched the city below go about its early morning. He had been at the window since before dawn. He had not slept. The sheets on his bed were undisturbed, and he was aware of this in a way that mocked him. He had a habit, when things were very bad, of cataloging everything that was in front of him to the exclusion of what was behind his eyes. The city below, the market quarter waking up, the smell of bread and animal and smoke coming through the window he'd cracked against the cold because the cold kept him honest. The street nearest the palace gates where a woman in a brown coat was carrying a basket on one arm and had stopped to look at something her child was holding up. The guards at the outer wall running their morning change with the particular smell of men who had stood all night in cold armor, metal and weariness, and the thin, bitter note of effort. He catalogued it all. He still felt what was behind his eyes. The decree had been Draveth's language, but the signature was his. He had told himself, every day for the 2 weeks between the council's decision and the morning of the signing, that this was the necessary thing. The Iron March required a wolf-born queen. This was not a preference. It was a structural reality, baked into the pack law that predated his father's reign and his grandfather's and every king before them. A queen without a wolf could not run the bond ceremony with the packs, could not participate in the hunt rites that sealed alliances, could not, if the worst came, and the bonds needed protecting, fight. This was what the council had told him, methodically, every day for those 2 weeks, until the argument had the quality of a fact he'd been handed, rather than one he'd examined. What he had not examined, what he had not let himself examine, was the other smell. The one that had been in that hall for 3 years. The one that had started the morning after his wedding night. A scent that should not have been possible for a wolfless bond. the deep, warm resonance of pack magic taking root. He'd told himself it was ambient, an artifact of the palace, and all the wolves who'd passed through it. He'd told himself this long past the point where he believed it. The child below held up what appeared to be a frog. The mother made the face mothers make. He turned away from the window. On his desk, the morning's correspondence, sealed in a stack. Below that, the council agenda. Below that, the petition from Lord Rowan of the Eastern Ridge, who had a daughter, wolf-shifted at 15, strong and well-connected, who would make an excellent queen consort. He put his hand flat on the desk and did not pick up any of it. His lead advisor, a hard-angled woman named Cirrus, who had been advising Ironmarch King since Aldrich was learning his letters, appeared at the study door without knocking, which was her consistent style and his consistent irritation. She wore her gray-streaked hair cut blunt at the jaw, and she had a habit when assessing a situation of tipping her chin slightly right, like a wolf listening for something. She did it now. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you, Ceres. You also smell terrible." This was a specific observation in a world of scent readers, and they both knew it. Wolves in distress emitted a particular register. Not quite fear, not quite grief. Something adjacent to both that was specific to the kind of pain that comes from a self-inflicted wound. He had been smelling it off himself since yesterday morning, and had been hoping, without basis, that no one would mention it. "What do you need?" he said. "The Ridge petition requires an answer. Tell him I'm reviewing it. You've been reviewing it for a week." She stepped further into the room, unhurried, and tilted her chin at him. She was never just a political inconvenience, Aldrich. "Don't. I'm not suggesting—" "Ceres." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she'd been giving him since he was 12, which was the expression of a woman who has decided to let a person fail and then be there when they understand it. "The Ridge girl will be here in 3 weeks. The council has already begun making arrangements." A pause. "I thought you should know the timeline." After she left, he stood in his study for a long time. The city smell came through the window. Bread and smoke and cold and life. All of it going on without reference to what he'd done. The bond magic he hadn't talked about in 3 years sat in his chest like a coal that had gone gray on the outside, but was not, he was discovering, entirely cold. He picked up the morning's correspondence, put it down, picked up the council agenda, put it down, went to the window again, watched the woman in the brown coat move down the street with her basket, and her child. The frog apparently no longer in evidence, the child now attached to her hand, he thought. And he did not want to think this, worked against it with everything he had. He thought of the way Seraphine had turned and walked out of that hall, the straight back, the deliberate pace, the precise, controlled dignity of a woman who had decided that they could take everything except that. He'd watched from the corner of his eye because he could not watch directly, could not afford to. The bond magic had surged in his chest the moment she turned, the gray coal flaring hot and sudden, and he'd gripped the pen hard enough to leave a mark on the parchment beside his signature, and he'd let her walk out, and the doors had closed and the coal had settled back into its gray silence, and he had not moved for 40 seconds. He knew because he'd counted. He didn't know what he was counting toward. He only knew that when the number reached 40, the doors had not opened again, and that was when it had become real. 3 weeks into Ashenmere, and the thing Seraphine had refused to name had developed a shape. It happened in stages, the way becoming usually does. Not a sudden arrival, but an accumulation. Each instant small enough to explain away. The total undeniable. The first was the warmth. She'd noticed it the morning after her arrival, standing at the river. The ground against the soles of her boots had carried a warmth inconsistent with the season. Something conducted upward from deep in the earth. She'd thought. The river. The thermal layer. Geological. She'd filed it. The second was the scent. It intensified over days. Not external, not something carried on the wind, but something that seemed to come from her own skin. A deepening of her natural scent. Layers added beneath the surface layer the way music gains depth when lower notes are added. Marin noticed first. "You smell different," she said one morning, looking up from the mending she was doing by the kitchen fire. "Different how?" Marin considered. "Older," she finally said, "like the house smells. But better." She paused. "Like the land." The third was the dreams. Not the running dream from the first night, something more complex. In these dreams she stood in the river, waist deep, and the water was warm, and the forest across the bank was not empty. She could see shapes moving in it, dark and large and purposeful. She was not afraid of them. They were waiting. She understood in the dream, with the calm logic of dreams, that they had been waiting a very long time, and that she was late, and that they did not blame her for this. She woke from one of these to find her hands were pressed to the floorboards, and the floorboards were warm. She sat there in the early dark and pressed her palms down harder and breathed, and what came back up through the wood and the stone beneath was not magic in the theatrical sense she'd always privately dismissed. No light, no sound, nothing a skeptic could point to. It was more like recognition. The land under the house recognizing the weight of her, the pressure of her palms, the scent of her presence. Like finding a door you'd assumed was a wall. She told Brennan the next morning. He was in the overgrown kitchen garden, working at the dead growth with methodical patience, each stroke of his curved blade uncovering more of what had been there before. He listened to her describe it without interrupting, his blade moving steadily, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "The Western Marches," he said, "were the first settled territory of the Iron March, before the capital, before the palace." He cleared a length of stone border, moved along it. The first Alpha's bonded mate was from this land. She had no wolf. His blade paused. The histories in the capital say she was a political convenience, a woman chosen from a neutral line to keep the peace. They say the bond was never complete. "But," Seraphine said, "the histories here," he glanced at her, "say something different." She waited. "The bond completed," he said. "Just not in the way they expected. She didn't shift into a wolf." He resumed cutting. "The land did." Seraphine stood still. The winter air came in off the river, carrying that green old scent, and it moved through her like a chord struck on a string she hadn't known was tuned. "I don't understand what that means," she said. "No," Brennan said. "Not yet." The letter from the capital arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a royal rider who looked as if he'd been told to make the journey efficiently, and who handed the sealed envelope to Marin at the door with the manner of a man delivering something moderately inconvenient, then departed without waiting for a reply. The seal was not Aldrich's. It was the council's. Draveth's personal seal. The thistle and chain that the Castellan had used on every official communication for 30 years. Seraphine held it for a moment. The paper was fine, the kind that spoke money and power. It smelled of the capital, iron and pine, and the particular layered scent of a building that housed hundreds of wolves, the press of pack scent, thick and almost overwhelming to her memory. She broke the seal and read. It was brief. It informed her that the provision stipend had been reviewed and would be adjusted downward, effective the following month, due to budget reallocations. It noted that the Ashenmere property was to be evaluated for potential sale to Lord Casson of the Midlands, who had expressed interest in the Western Territory. It recommended she consider the council's offer of relocation to a smaller accommodation in the southern city of Ravane. It did not ask. It informed. "Well," Marin said, reading over her shoulder. "They're not finished with me," Seraphine said. "They never were." She folded the letter, set it on the table, looked at it. The kitchen fire popped. Outside the window, the overgrown garden held its stillness, and beyond it the orchard, and beyond that the slope to the river and the old forest across the water. "If they sell Ashenmere," she said slowly, "whoever buys it gets the land." "Yes. And if they reduce the stipend far enough, you can't maintain it. And then I have no choice but Ravane." She picked up the letter, held it near the fire without letting it touch the flame. "This is Draveth cleaning the board." Marin made a sound that was not quite a word. Her gold ring caught the firelight. "What are you going to do?" Seraphine looked at the letter, set it back on the table, well away from the fire. "I'm going to find out what this land is worth," she said, "before they can price it." She started going to the river every morning. This was not a decision she made deliberately. It was a decision her feet made, repeatedly, before she was fully awake, until she recognized the pattern and stopped resisting it. She would dress in the dark, and go down the slope, and stand at the water's edge, and the land would breathe its morning breath up through the earth and into her, and she would breathe back, and each time the exchange went a little further. She began to understand it in the terms available to her. Not wolf terms, because she had never had those, but in the language of the bond mark that had never fully explained itself in 3 years of marriage. Pack bonds, she had been taught, were a resonance between two wolves. The magic that connected them ran through both their animals, deepened by each shared run, each territorial acknowledgement. A wolfless bond was, in theory, no bond at all. The theory was wrong. She could feel it now, out here in the cold morning air with the river running dark between her and the old forest. What she'd been carrying for 3 years was not an absence. It was a patience, something that had been waiting, not for the wolf she didn't have, but for the land that was hers. She pressed her palm to the cold earth. The warmth came up immediately, quicker than before, more certain. "Good morning," she said quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous and absolutely not caring. The river answered in the only language rivers have. It was enough. She came back inside with mud on her knees and the deep green scent woven into her coat so thoroughly that Marin looked up from her tea and said, "You found it, didn't you?" "Found what?" "Whatever you've been going to the river to find." She sat down, poured herself tea, held the cup with both hands and felt the warmth of it, the mundane, small warmth of a cup, and felt underneath that the other warmth, the one that didn't go away when she came inside. "I don't know what I've found yet," she said, "but it's mine." Marin looked at her for a moment with the expression she only wore when she'd decided not to say the thing she was thinking. Then she said, "Are you going to tell me about the letter from the Castellan?" "Tomorrow," Seraphine said. "It's bad?" "It's an attempt." She sipped her tea. "There's a difference." She was in the East Wing, the partially collapsed one, which she'd decided to assess rather than avoid, when she heard the horses. Not one horse. Multiple. The sound carried from the front drive, hoofbeats on old gravel, and the smell came with the sound. Wolf pack, armor sweat, the mineral-sharp bite of weapons oil. Official. Capital. Her first thought was, they've come to enforce the sale already. Her second thought, arriving half a breath behind, the scent beneath the official one. She knew that scent. She had catalogued it. 3 years of marriage, of waking next to it and falling asleep in it and reading all its variations. the iron and cold mountain of his public face, the pine resin that meant thinking, the brief, warmer thing when his guard slipped. She'd thought she'd left that knowledge behind in the palace, thought she'd locked it in a box and given the box away. She had not. Her body knew it before her mind admitted it, the way the body always knows things the mind hasn't decided about yet. Her breathing changed. Not faster, not slower, just different, like a dial adjusting. She walked out of the east wing, through the house, and opened the front door herself. He was already off his horse. He'd always been quick off a horse. He stood in her broken drive with autumn mud on his boots and road dust on his coat, and his 2 guards held back at a respectful distance, and he looked at her. He looked at her directly, no averted gaze, and his jaw was doing the thing, working hard. He smelled of a long ride and of the iron and mountain, and underneath all of it, underneath everything, that warm rain on dry earth thing that she'd identified once and never forgotten and had not expected to smell again. She said nothing. He said, "I need to speak with you." His voice was the same. Of course it was. She'd thought maybe distance would have changed the way it landed in her chest. Lower, more resonant than his frame suggested. The voice of someone who had learned to use silence as a tool, and therefore made words count when he used them. "Do you?" she said. "Please." That surprised her. She didn't let it show. She stepped back from the doorway and let him in, and if her hands were not entirely still, well, her hands were her own business. She brought him to the kitchen, because the kitchen was the only warm room, and because bringing him to the kitchen rather than any formal room was a choice, small but real. That said, you have no status here. Only she had status here. Even with 2 guards outside and the ring on his hand and all the weight of the Iron March behind him, in this kitchen, at this rough table, he was just a man who had driven 3 days to speak to a woman he'd put on a carriage and sent away. Marin appeared, saw him, and had the profound self-possession to set down a cup of tea in front of him and remove herself from the room without a word. The gold ring flashed in her ear. She was, Seraphine thought, extraordinary. Aldrich wrapped his hands around the cup. He did not drink. He looked at the table for a moment, then up at her. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. His jaw worked. "I need to say something." "Then say it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, the bond didn't break. She had expected many things. Several apologies she'd rehearsed responses to. The council's official position, relayed to her through his mouth, requiring something from her. Some negotiation about the estate or the stipend. She had not prepared for this. She kept her expression still. "What?" "When I signed the decree. When you left." He turned the cup in his hands, not looking at it, looking at her. "The bond magic doesn't break when the form dissolves. I was told it would. I was told a wolfless bond was incomplete and that dissolving it would sever it cleanly. A breath. It didn't. What did it do? He stopped. Something moved across his face, the particular struggle of a person reaching for words in territory they do not have language for. It changed pitch, like a string under different tension. His thumb moved across the surface of the cup. "It's been changing since you left. Every day. Getting stronger," she said. Not a question. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. The fire cracked. Outside, the river moved in its dark, deliberate way. The land breathed under her feet, steady and patient, and she felt it in that moment with particular clarity, the warmth of it, the old, deep belonging of it, and alongside that, like a second thread in the same music, the pulse of the bond. Not broken, not dissolved, becoming. "Why are you here, Aldrich?" she asked. The sound of his name in her mouth made the muscle in his cheek move. Because Draveth wants to sell Ashenmere, and I can't let him. Can't, she said carefully. Or won't. He looked at her for a long time. The bond magic moved between them in the kitchen air, not visible, not audible, but present. She could smell it now, she realized. The warm rain thing. It was the bond, and it was his. And it was here in her kitchen at this rough table because he'd driven 3 days with it pressing at him, and he hadn't been able to not come. Both, he said. She walked him around the estate that afternoon, not because she owed him a tour. She owed him nothing. She was quite clear about this in her own mind. But because she wanted him to see it. Wanted. With a cold, bright satisfaction, she allowed herself to feel fully, for him to understand what he had sent her to and what she had made of it in a month. Or rather, what it had made of her. She brought him through the kitchen garden where the dead growth was slowly being cleared to the old borders beneath, past the orchard with its bare-armed trees standing patient in the cold, down the slope to the river. His guards had stayed at the house, at his instruction. She'd noticed that. She stopped at the water's edge. The afternoon light was low and gold, and the river caught it in moving pieces. Aldrich stood beside her, and the land was doing the thing it always did under her feet now, breathing, warm, present, and she felt it triple in intensity with his proximity, not because of him but because of what hummed between them, the bond, responding to its other end. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "You feel that," she said. "I've felt it since I stepped onto the grounds." He was looking at the river, at the old forest beyond it, and his profile was the same profile she'd studied from the corner of her eye at 100 state dinners, strong-boned and contained. "What is it?" she decided to tell him. Not everything. She was still careful, still herself. But enough. About the land history. About Brennan and the 2 women sent here before her. About the warmth under the earth, the deepening scent, the dreams. He was very still while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You think you're shifting," he said. "Just not the way everyone expected." "I think the bond was never broken," she said. "I think it was always completing, and I think the land is part of how." He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was on his face, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled neutrality of the king, not the closed jaw of the council chamber, but something raw and almost young. The expression of a man confronting something he'd told himself was not true. "Sarah," he said. She had not heard him say her name in the short form. In 3 years of marriage he had called her Seraphine, always the full version, always with its formality. This was the first time, and it landed in her chest with the soft precision of a key. She looked away from him, back at the river. "You signed the paper," she said. "I know." "You didn't look at me." His breath caught. She heard it, felt the change in the bond scent, the warm rain thing with a sharp note added, the note of a man cutting himself on his own sharp places. "I couldn't," he said. "That's not good enough." "No," he said. "It isn't." The river moved. The cold came off the water and wrapped around them both, and the land breathed up through their feet and around them both, and she was very aware of the few inches between them, of the warmth of him despite the cold, of the scent of him that 3 years of marriage had made as familiar as her own heartbeat. She did not close the inches. "You should stay the night," she said. "The road back in the dark is poor." A pause. "Is that an invitation?" "It's a logistical observation." She turned and walked back toward the house. "You can sleep in the east wing. Some of it still has a ceiling." He stayed 2 nights. She hadn't planned for that. Or rather, she hadn't planned not to plan for it, which amounted to the same thing. He was there at dinner, in her kitchen, at her rough table, and Brennan appeared from wherever Brennan went in the evenings and sat at the table too, and the 4 of them ate together with a formality that had entirely collapsed by the time the soup was done, and been replaced by something more honest. It was Brennan who broke it, the way Brennan broke most things, with the quality of a man who found pretense more exhausting than truth. "You're the one who signed the decree," he said to Aldrich, with the tone of a man stating a fact, not making an accusation. Aldrich looked at him. "Yes." "You knew the bond hadn't broken." Not a question. Aldrich looked at Marin, who looked back at him with the expression of someone who is not going to help him with this. He looked at Seraphine. "I told myself it was residue," he said, "that it would dissolve over time." "Have you made a habit," Brennan said, conversationally, cutting bread, "of lying to yourself about important things?" The silence had the quality of a room where everyone is waiting for something to happen. Seraphine picked up her cup. Aldrich's jaw did the thing. "Yes," he finally said. "It appears I have." Marin made a sound that might have been a laugh, converted at the last second to a cough. Her ring flashed. The evening went longer than dinner. Brennan produced from somewhere in the house's depths a bottle of something amber that tasted of smoke and river water and age, and they sat by the kitchen fire, and Brennan talked about the land with the ease of someone telling his own story. And Aldrich listened the way he listened when he was genuinely hearing something, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Completely still, the way still water runs deep. When Brennan described the 2 women sent to Ashenmere before, Aldrich's stillness changed quality. She felt the change without looking at him. The bond carried it. A tension. A tightening. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His hands were flat on the table, very still. "Both women sent here were declared wolfless by the palace examiners," Brennan said. "Both had, in fact, a wolf. It had simply not taken the form the examiners expected." "What form did it take?" Aldrich asked. Brennan looked at Seraphine. She looked back at him. She had been thinking about this for weeks, had been feeling her way toward it in the morning dark at the river, in the dreams, in the warmth that came up through the stone and the wood when she pressed her palms down. She did not have full language for it yet, but she had the beginning of it. "Not a single animal," she said. "The land." Brennan nodded once, slowly. "The old term is earth-bonded," he said. "It was common once, in the first generations of the Iron March, before the palace standardized what a wolf was supposed to look like. An earth-bonded woman doesn't shift into a single wolf form. She shifts into the territory." He paused. "Let that sit. She becomes the pack's ground." Aldrich was very still. "The Western Marches," Brennan continued, "have been declining for 60 years. The river runs lower each year. The forest across the water has been retreating. The old packs that held this territory before consolidation, their descendants are scattered, bonding to nothing. The land has been waiting." He looked at Seraphine with those pale, seeing eyes. For its queen, she woke in the deep middle of the second night, and the house was silent and the land was loud. Loud in the way that only she could hear. Not sound exactly, but a pressure, a pull, the accumulated gravity of something wanting to open. She sat up. Her hands were tingling. She pressed them flat on the floor beside her bed, and what came back up was heat, real heat, not the gentle warmth of before, but something more urgent. She dressed, went downstairs, out. The night was winter clear, the stars enormous, the ground under her feet rimed with frost that crackled. She walked without deciding where, the way her feet had decided every morning about the river, and the river was where she arrived, at the water's edge in starlight, her breath making cloud. The dark forest across the water alive with the quiet that isn't quiet at all but the sound of 1,000 small living things all existing simultaneously. She pressed her palms to the earth. It took her, or she gave herself to it. She couldn't have said which, even after, and she thought they might be the same. The warmth she'd been feeling for weeks rushed up through her palms and into her arms and chest, and down through her legs, and she was on her hands and knees in the frost, and the land was breathing in perfect time with her breathing. And she was not afraid. She was something adjacent to afraid that was actually awe, because she could feel the territory from inside it, could feel the river as if it ran through her own blood, could feel the old forest across the bank as if it were her own fur, could feel the retreating warmth of the hibernating things in the earth as something she could hold and keep. She felt, miles to the east, the scattered descendants of the old crestfall packs, could feel each of them like a distant note, unanchored, running on land with no bond resonance to run through. She understood, with the certainty of the body rather than the mind, that they had been running on no ground for years, that they had been waiting for the ground to come back. She could be that ground, not a wolf, not one animal, the land itself, holding them all. She knelt at the river's edge until the stars began to fade. Then she stood up, frost on her hands and knees, mud on her palms. The bond magic in her chest was burning steady, warm and patient, the same rhythm as the land under her feet. She breathed. She had been wolfless her whole life. Every examiner, every court doctor, every well-meaning council member who had offered condolences had used that word, had made it the defining fact of her, the absence that outweighed every presence. The land didn't care about that word. The land knew her. And the scattered packs in the dark to the east had felt something shift tonight. She could feel them feeling it, like a vibration reaching the end of a long string. And they would come. Not because she'd called, because the ground had answered. She walked back to the house. He was at the kitchen door. She stopped. He'd woken when she'd gone out, clearly. He was half-dressed, coat thrown over his sleeping clothes, his hair in the undone state she'd never seen at court, because at court he was always fully assembled before anyone could see him otherwise. His feet were bare on the cold stone step, which meant he'd moved fast without thinking about it. He looked at her, at the mud on her hands, the frost on her coat, her face in the early dark, and the bond magic in her chest responded to him with the particular urgency of something that has been quiet a long time and finds itself suddenly free to be loud. His breath was visible in the cold. He didn't speak. "I know what I am," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The bond warmth moved between them in the night air, and neither of them pretended not to feel it. "Tell me," he said. So she did. Standing in the frozen dark with the house behind them, and the river below, and the first gray light of winter dawn beginning to separate the sky from the tree line, she told him everything. All of it. What Brennan had told her. What she'd felt at the river in the night. The packs to the east moving on unanchored ground. The land under her feet right now. Breathing. He listened without interrupting, without looking away. When she finished, the dawn was real. Gray-pink in the east. A bird somewhere in the orchard. "I have to go back," he said. She went still. "Not..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "There are things I have to do before I can..." "Sarah. There are things that need to be undone before anything else can be done. The decree. Draveth's petition for the estate sale. The ridge arrangement. A breath. I need you to give me time to undo them." She looked at him in the cold morning light, looked at his bare feet on the cold stone, the absent way his hands had come up as if wanting to reach for something, the open expression on his face that the assembled king never wore. "How long?" she said. "A month." "And if I say no?" He looked at her with those eyes that she had been reading for 3 years, that she had catalogued and learned and thought she'd put away. "Then I'll undo them anyway," he said. "It'll just be harder." Something warm moved through her chest. She did not let it show entirely. "Go," she said. "And Aldrich." He looked at her. "Put your shoes on first." He left in the early morning, and she stood in the broken drive and watched the horses go, and Maren stood beside her with the quiet of a person who is containing a large number of opinions very successfully. "Well," Maren said, after the last sound of hoofbeats faded. "Don't. I'm not saying anything. You're about to say several things." Maren was quiet for 1 second. "He has very nice bare feet." Seraphine laughed. The sound surprised her, full and real and unguarded, coming up from somewhere she hadn't been sure still existed. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and Maren was already laughing too, leaning into her shoulder, and the cold morning air was full of the green deep scent of the land and the sound of 2 women laughing in a broken drive at the edge of nowhere. And it was, she thought, one of the better sounds she'd made in years. The first of the Crestfall descendants arrived 12 days later. She'd known they were coming before she saw them, felt them in the land, the same way she could feel the river's direction without being at the river, a presence moving toward her through the territory. She was in the overgrown orchard when they came through the estate gate, 4 of them, wolves by scent but in human form, young and travel-worn and cautious in the way of people who have been unanchored long enough to have forgotten what ground feels like. The eldest was a woman of perhaps 40, who moved with the carefulness of someone who had once known power and had learned not to trust the appearance of safety. She stopped at the edge of the orchard, the others behind her. "We felt the land wake," she said. There was no question in it. "Yes," Seraphine said. The woman looked at her, looking hard, looking the way pack members look at something they're trying to scent read at distance. Whatever she found, it shifted something in her expression. "You're not a wolf." "No," Seraphine said. "I'm something else." The woman was quiet. Behind her, the 3 younger ones were looking at the ground, the house, the orchard, the way people look at things they might be allowed to stay near. "Is this land yours?" the woman asked. Seraphine felt the land breathe under her feet, felt it breathe through the orchard and under the house and down to the river and across the water into the old forest and in every direction as far as the western marches ran. Her land. Old land. Land that had been waiting for a particular kind of woman and had found her in the ruins of a disgrace. "Yes," she said, "and you're welcome in it." More came after that. Not a flood, a trickle, then a steady stream. The scattered packs felt the lands waking the way a sleeping person feels the warmth of a fire and turns toward it without choosing to. They came in 1s and 2s, a few families, a handful of lone wolves, and each time she stood at the gate, and the land reached through her feet and recognized them, and they could feel it. She watched the same thing happen. The specific unclenching of people who have been running on ground that doesn't know their names. Brennan moved through all of it with the calm of a man who has been waiting for this for a long time, and is simply glad to see it arrive. He knew where the old pack meeting ground was, 1/2 a mile west, the ring of stones on raised earth that predated the estate. He knew which wells were still good and which cellars could be repurposed. He knew the land's history the way some people know music, not as a sequence of notes but as a living thing. By the month's end, Ashenmere was no longer a ruin. It was becoming something else. Something older than a ruin, which was a thing reclaiming its use. She wrote no letters to the capital. She'd considered it briefly and decided against it. Whatever Aldrich was doing in those chambers, he would do it better without her watching over his shoulder. She had her own work, her own ground. She was also, she noticed with detached interest, no longer afraid. This was not the absence of fear. That was a different thing. The flat, false calm of someone who has stopped caring. This was fuller than that, denser. The fear had been replaced by something that had taken up more room, and she thought the best word for it was ground, since she seemed to be in the business of learning what that word really meant. She stood at the river each morning, and the land opened through her, and the bond magic hummed its patient note, and she thought, "This is what I was. This is what I was always. It just needed this place to find itself in me." The message came 23 days after he'd left. Not a letter. A rider, but not a palace rider. A young wolf, barely 18, who had ridden hard enough to be dusty to the shoulders, carrying a sealed note with Aldrich's personal seal rather than the council's. She broke it in the kitchen with Marin across the table watching her with careful eyes. It was short. 4 lines. The decree of dissolution is being reviewed by the full pack council, not Draveth's committee. The estate sale petition has been formally withdrawn. Lord Ridge has been told the arrangement is no longer available. There is one thing remaining. I need you to come to the capital. Below that, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the lines above, as if added after deliberation. Not as a petitioner. Not as a former queen. On your terms. I will meet you however you arrive. She read it twice, set it face down on the table. Marin said nothing. Her ring caught the light. She was very deliberately looking at the wall. He withdrew the estate sale, Seraphine said. I heard. Before I answered. Yes, Marin said. That's the point. Seraphine turned the note over. Read it again. His handwriting had a particular quality, uniformly controlled in official correspondence, and then, in the informal things, those moments when the control had slipped in the 3 years she'd learned him, a slant appeared, a slight pressure on certain letters. It was there in the last 2 sentences. She thought about the council chambers, about Lord Draveth and his thistle and chain seal and his letters that informed rather than asked, about the assembled court that had looked at the floor while they stripped her title, about the Ridge girl who would have made an excellent queen by every measure the council valued. She thought about the land under her feet, warm and breathing, and the packs who had come back to it, and what she was here, in this place, in her own right. Then she stood up and said, Pack for 2 weeks. Marin looked at her. 2 weeks, why? Because I intend to come back. She set the note on the table and walked to the kitchen window, the one that looked out on the overgrown garden and the orchard and the slope to the river. And when I come back, I want to be able to stay. They traveled in the old brown carriage, which had become something she'd grown fond of in the way of things that were present during important events. Brennan stood at the gate to watch them go, one hand raised in a gesture that was not quite a wave, more like an acknowledgement. She looked back at him through the carriage window as they turned onto the road. He'll be here when we get back, Marin said. He's been here since before I was born. Yes. Marin settled her small dark head against the cushion. That's exactly what I mean. The road east to the capital was the same road she'd traveled in the opposite direction 2 months ago, and the same and not the same. The way all returns are different from departures. The forest pressed close on both sides, the same enormous dark pines, but she could feel the land under the wheels now. Not just Ashenmere's land, but the territory she moved through. Reading it the way you read text you've only recently learned, slowly and with great attention to each word. She breathed. She was not the woman who had walked out of the throne hall counting steps. She was continuous with that woman, the same body, the same eyes, the same hands. But she had more rooms now. The land had opened them. Rooms she hadn't known were sealed. She was also nervous, and she allowed herself to notice this. Not the hollowing fear of before. This was sharper. The nervousness of a person walking toward something real. The bond magic in her chest had been strengthening by increments since they'd crossed off Ashenmere land and moved east, as if the distance between her and its other end had a sound, and that sound was getting louder. He was in the capital. She was moving toward him. The bond had been doing this the whole time, she realized, completing itself not through a ceremony or a shift or any of the things the palace doctrine said it required. Through time. Through loss. Through the long patience of two people carrying the same thread from different ends without knowing the thread was still whole. It was whole. She pressed her palm to the carriage door, and beneath the wood and the road she could feel the land, present and steady, all the way. The capital smelled the same, iron and pine and the layered press of pack scent, hundreds of wolves living in proximity, the ambient hum of the iron march at work. She smelled it before she saw the walls. The carriage windows were fogged with the cold, and her body registered it with the complicated response of something familiar that is no longer home. Ashenmere was home. This was something she had to walk through, something she had to complete. They came through the palace gate at mid-afternoon, and she was aware, the way you are aware of a room going quiet when you enter, that they were being watched. Guards at the gate who recognized her and said nothing. Attendants in the yard who turned. She kept her eyes forward and her spine where it belonged. Aldrich was not in the yard. She had not expected him to be. He was the Alpha King. He was not going to stand in a yard. But his scent was here, everywhere. The palace saturated with it the way any place becomes saturated with the presence of the wolf who holds it. She walked through it, and the bond rang like a struck bell. An attendant led them to rooms, her rooms, she realized, the ones she'd had as queen, and the fact that they were open and prepared meant something she didn't let herself read too carefully yet. Marin unpacked. Seraphine washed the road off her face and hands and stood for a moment in the center of the room, pressing her palm to the floor. The stone was cold. No warmth came up. This was not her land. Good, she thought. She'd remember that. Remember the difference. He's requesting an audience, Marin said from the doorway. His words. At whatever time is convenient. She almost smiled. Tomorrow morning. Here. He came at the first hour after dawn, and he came without guards. She had left the door of her rooms open, and she heard his step in the corridor before he reached the door. That particular gate. The one she'd catalogued 3 years ago. Deliberate and quiet. The step of a man accustomed to moving through spaces as their fullest authority. He stopped in the doorway. She was standing at the window with her tea, looking out at the capital waking, and she turned at the sound of him, and they were in the same room, and the bond magic completed the remaining distance between them with a sound she felt rather than heard. A resonance, a chord coming into tune. He looked at her with the look she'd been given at the river, the one without the king's face on it. You came, he said. You asked on my terms, she said. These are my terms. This room. He stepped in. The door was still open, and she noticed he hadn't moved to close it. That was deliberate, she thought. His way of saying he was not here to trap her. The decree, he said. The full council has reviewed it. Draveth's legal basis was narrow to begin with. The wolf-born requirement was never formally codified. It was customary, and I should have questioned it earlier. I didn't. He paused. That's on me. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at her. The estate sale is cancelled. The land at Ashenmere is being formally recognized as Western Marches Heritage Territory, which gives it protection from any council petition. The stipend question is— I don't need the stipend, she said. He stopped. Ashenmere supports itself, she said. Or it will. The packs that have come back to that territory, they're reforming. There are 12 families there now, and more coming. The land holds them. She paused. I hold them. The muscle in his cheek. Working. How? Because I'm earth-bonded. She said it plainly, the words clean and settled in her mouth, no longer tentative. It's what I am. The palace examiners were looking for the wrong thing. They thought no wolf meant no power. They were wrong. Silence. He was very still. She could smell him, the pine and cold, and the warm rain thing, the full register of him. And the bond magic between them was a living presence in the room, had been since he'd walked in. Sarah, he said. The bond, she said before he could. I know it's still there. I've known for weeks. Then you know? I know what I know, she said. I don't know what I want to do about it yet, and that's where we are. He looked at her with the raw young expression from the river, the one stripped of the king's face, and she held his gaze and held her ground, her own ground, carried now from a place 2 days east, present in her feet even in this cold stone room. What do I need to do? He said. She thought about it. The genuine question she'd been circling since the morning at the river when she'd told him, and he'd said, Tell me. When he'd listened, when he'd come back here and done the work before asking her back. There's a council meeting today, she said. She knew this. Marin had found out. The full pack council, the one reviewing the decree. Yes. I want to come. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched the calculation move through him. Or not a calculation. Something more basic. The decision of a man who understands the weight of what is being asked. As what? He said. She looked at him steadily. As the earth-bonded holder of the Western Marches and the pack ground of the Crestfall territory. As the woman who walked out of this palace 2 months ago and built something in a ruin while you signed correspondence. A beat. Or as nothing. Your choice. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, As everything you just named. The council chamber smelled of old power and the accumulated anxiety of 12 assembled lords, each carrying the scent of a different pack, the overlapping registers of wolf dominance and politics creating a dense, complicated atmosphere that she read with her whole body. She had walked into rooms like this before as queen consort, always one step behind and to the left, always in the position of a woman whose relevance to the proceedings was primarily decorative. She had learned to make herself still in those rooms, to take up the minimum of space, to let her presence be defined entirely by his. She did not do that now. She walked in beside him. Not behind, not in front. Beside, which was the position she'd decided on in the corridor, and which he had adjusted his own pace to accommodate without being asked, which she noticed. The lords went still. Draveth was at the head of the council table, his thistle and chain seal visible on the papers before him, his spotted hands flat on the wood. He looked at her with the expression of a man seeing something that does not fit in the category he'd assigned it. She sat down, beside Aldrich, who sat at the head. The chair was the consort's chair, technically, and if anyone wanted to make something of that, they could. No one did. My lords, Aldrich said, before the decree review proceeds, I'm requesting that you hear from the holder of the Western Marches territory on the matter of its status and the conditions currently in place. Draveth said, carefully, The Western Marches is the location of the Ashenmere estate, which is a functioning pack territory, Seraphine said, with 12 families currently in residence and more coming, bonded to the ground under my governance. She kept her voice even, kept the warmth she felt like iron in it, not cold, not aggressive, but immovable. The territory has been formally recognized as heritage land. The estate sale is cancelled, and the Wolfless declaration in the original decree is incorrect and requires revision. The room was very quiet. One of the younger lords near the far end was leaning forward slightly. The declaration was made by certified palace examiners, Draveth said. The declaration was made by examiners who were testing for the wrong thing, she said. I am earth-bonded. It's an old form, documented in the Iron March's own pre-consolidation histories, which several of you may not have read because they were not considered relevant until now. She looked at Draveth directly. They are relevant now. Draveth looked at Aldrich, the look of a man who is recalibrating and is not pleased about needing to. Aldrich met his gaze, said nothing. He didn't need to. The quality of his silence had the full weight of the Iron March throne behind it. The bond, one of the other lords said. Lord Fenwick, she placed him, the pack lord of the Northern Ridge, a man she'd always found less given to political maneuvering than the rest. The bond dissolution was a second ground of the decree. If the first ground fails, the bond never dissolved, Aldrich said. His voice was level, factual, a statement of territory. I have direct evidence of this. The bond magic remains active and has been strengthening. The grounds of the decree are therefore both invalid. Silence. Seraphine breathed through it. The land was not under her feet here. She was on cold palace stone, far from the river and the earth she knew. But she could feel the bond beside her, warm and present, and she could feel, beneath the political weight of the room, something that was not performance. The truth of the thing she'd been carrying for 2 months and before that for 3 years. The truth that the land had helped her name. She had been wolfless. She had also always been this. The decree, Draveth said at last, with the tone of a man conceding a specific and limited thing, will require full council review. It will require council reversal, she said. Today. Lord Fenwick looked at her. Then he did something unexpected. He looked at Aldrich, and then back at her, and then he put his hand flat on the table in the old pack gesture of acknowledgement, the one that predated all the court formality, the simple recognition of ground. Call the vote, he said. The vote went 7-5. Draveth's face, during the count, was a study in controlled neutrality that she had seen on council members before. The expression of a person filing the result away for future use. She noted it. She would need to note these things. Going forward. Going forward. She sat with that phrase in the back of her mind while the formalities concluded around her. Afterward, in the corridor, Aldrich walked beside her and said nothing for long enough that she glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead with the expression she'd catalogued as thinking. 7-5, she said. Fenwick brought 2 others, he said. I thought it would be 6-6. You broke the tie. She thought about this. By being in the room. By being exactly what you were in that room. He stopped walking. She stopped. They were in a side corridor, one of the narrow stone passages that connected the formal spaces, and it was empty and quiet, and the afternoon light came through a slit window and fell across the floor between them. I need to ask you something. She waited. When I came to Ashenmere, he said, you asked me why I chose you. In the mate selection, I deflected. She hadn't asked that exactly. She'd implied it, in the line about not understanding why. but close enough. You did. I chose you, he said, because when you walked into the first assembly, you were the only person in the room who wasn't performing. Every other woman there, wolf-born, well-connected, dominant, they were all showing me their strength. And you walked in and looked at the arrangement of the furniture like you were planning how you'd rearrange it. Something moved through his expression, brief and complicated. And then you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your time. She stared at him. I had never been looked at like that, he said. I had been looked at with calculation and fear and desire and a dozen other things. Never like you were taking my measure and hadn't finished yet. His jaw did the thing, briefly. I didn't know what to do about it, so I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was be the Alpha King, and I spent 3 years hoping that was going to be enough. She breathed. It wasn't, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. The light moved on the floor as a cloud shifted somewhere above the window. She looked at it for a moment, looked at him. The bond, she said. If I come back. On your terms, he said. I know, you said. I mean the bond completion. The earth bond and the mate bond together. Brennan said it's different from a standard completion. I'd need to be on my own land for it to work properly, at Ashenmere. He looked at her steadily. All right. The Western Marches would need to be formally designated as my territory. Mine, not the Crown's. I hold it. I govern it. Done. Aldrich. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you what I need. I need to know you're hearing me. I hear you, he said. Simply, without the layers. She looked at him for a long moment. The bond moved in her chest, warm and certain, and she let herself feel it clearly for the first time in 2 months. Not guarded, not examined, just felt. Then I'll come back, she said. But not today. I need 2 weeks. To do what? To go home first, she said. To Ashenmere. To tell Brennan and the families what's happened. To make sure the ground is ready. She paused. And to be ready myself. He was quiet. She could see him working against the instinct to push. The impatient alpha. The man used to things resolving at his speed. Working against it. And succeeding. 2 weeks, he said. Then I'll come back, she said. And we'll do this properly. He looked at her with the expression from the corridor the morning after the council. Not the king's face, the real one. Open and young and slightly undone. His hands were at his sides, and she could see them wanting to do something, to close the distance between them, and not doing it. She appreciated the restraint. She also appreciated stepping back, seeing it as he stepped carefully into the space she'd put between them, and offered her his arm for the walk back through the formal corridors. The deliberateness of that, choosing her terms over his impulse. It was not a small thing. 3 weeks later, she'd taken an extra one, just because she could, and because she'd felt him wait without complaint and that deserved acknowledgement. She came back to the capital with a delegation. 12 families from the reformed Crestfall territory. Lord Fenwick of the Northern Ridge, who had reached out after the council vote and said he'd like to speak about mutual pack interests, and had turned out to be a man she liked very much. Brennan, in a coat she'd never seen before, slightly less repaired than his usual one, who had appeared at the carriage with his curved blade on his belt, and said, when she raised an eyebrow, that he thought he'd better see how the thing turned out. Marin, with her gold ring and her frankness and her 2 bags, sat across from her in the carriage and watched the Capitol walls rise through the window. Ready? She said. No, Seraphine said, but that doesn't matter. The city gates opened. The city smell came in through the windows, iron and pine and pack and life, and the carriage moved through it with a sound that was, this time, entirely different from the sound of 2 months ago. Then, compression, shrinking, the movement of a woman being reduced. Now, arrival, the movement of something coming into a space that was going to have to accommodate it. She could feel the western marches land behind her, and under the road and in the soles of her feet. She could feel Ashenmere breathing, even here, the thread of it running east to west, like the river running high ground to low. She could feel the 12 families in the delegation carriages behind her, their pack warmth, their bond to the territory she carried. She could feel the mate bond in her chest, running north like a lodestone. She was afraid. She was fully alive. The distance between those two things, she had learned, was smaller than she'd thought. The carriage stopped. She had expected the formal entrance, courtyard, attendants, the protocol of arrival. She had not expected him to be standing at the foot of the steps. He was. Bareheaded, which was not what kings did at formal arrivals. His coat was the dark one she'd seen him wear on informal mornings, not the formal council coat. He stood at the foot of the steps with his hands at his sides, and he watched the carriage door open, and she stepped out. The courtyard was full. Word had traveled, as word always does in a place full of pack senses, and the attendants and guards and curious courtiers who had found reasons to be near the front yard stood in a loose ring, and they watched. She walked down the carriage steps and stood in front of him. He looked at her. She looked back. The bond magic was very loud. "My lord," she said. "Seraphine," he said, the full version, but not the formal version. The way you say a name when you're very glad the person is there. Behind her, 12 families came out of their carriages. Brennan appeared. Merrin, Lord Fenwick. The courtyard filled with the warm, rich scent of pack arriving. Not one pack, not the Iron March's capital pack with its iron and protocol, but a dozen different notes, the scattered, rejoined, rooted scent of wolves who have come back to their ground, and the ground has come to the capital on 2 feet to make a point. She heard the murmur move through the assembled watchers. Pack recognition was not a quiet thing. Aldrich looked at the people behind her, back at her. Something in his face had shifted past the controlled neutrality and past the raw young expression she'd learned more recently, into something she hadn't catalogued before, something that had the quality of arriving, finally, somewhere. He stepped forward, 1 step, closing the distance between them. He put both hands up, slowly, visible, nothing sudden, and took her face between his palms the way she had not known. Until he did it, she had been waiting to be held. "Welcome home," he said. And then, in the middle of the courtyard with 12 families watching and Draveth somewhere behind a window being appalled, and Marin almost certainly crying quietly, and Brennan smiling in the way that looks like still water, he pressed his forehead to hers. The bond magic completed. Not with thunder, not with light, with warmth. The specific warmth of something that has been cold a long time and finds its heat again, rushing through her blood and through the bond, and out into the land that trailed behind her like the train of a better gown than any she'd worn as queen consort, out into the 12 families behind her who felt it as a ripple of warmth through their pack bonds, out into the western marches themselves, the river and the forest and the cold earth and the stones on the old meeting ground 1/2 mile from the estate, warming. She breathed. He breathed. The courtyard was silent. She took 1 step back, not far, just enough, and turned to face the assembled court, the watchers in their ring, the courtiers who had looked at their feet while she walked out, the guards who had executed the exile with the blank faces of people following orders. She was not angry. She had thought she would be, at this moment, and she found instead something larger than anger, something that anger might be the early form of if it has the patience to grow. She was just herself, in the courtyard, with the land behind her, and the man beside her, and 12 families at her back who had run on unanchored ground and found their way to ground that knew them. Draveth appeared at the top of the steps. His thistle and chain seal was on his coat. His face was very still. She looked up at him. "My Lord Castellan," she said, and her voice carried the way voices do when a territory runs through them. "The review of the decree found both grounds invalid. I believe that's documented now." She let the pause hold for exactly as long as it needed to. "You'll find the Western Marches petition materials in the formal record. I'll expect the heritage designation documents within the week." He looked at her, at the people behind her, at Aldrich, who stood slightly behind and beside her in the arrangement she'd asked for, at her side, not in front of her, and who was, from what she could smell, not unhappy. "Of course," Draveth said. She nodded once, the nod of a person completing a brief and concluded thing, and turned back to her delegation. "Marin, let's get everyone inside." They went back to Ashenmere 3 days later. Not in the old brown carriage. In something better. Something Aldrich had arranged without being asked, and which arrived in the stable yard with good cushions and windows that actually fit their frames. She had made a point of not mentioning the old carriage, and he had arranged the new one anyway, which told her something about what he'd been paying attention to. She sat at the window as the capital fell behind them, and the pines rose up on both sides and the road narrowed into a track, and she felt the land greeting her return the way a river greets the rain. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a gathering, a rising, an accumulation of welcome that had been building toward her for 3 days. He was beside her. They sat in comfortable quiet, the way 2 people sit who have survived enough in proximity to each other that silence has become its own form of conversation. Marin was across from them, reading. Her feet were curled under her, and the gold ring in her ear caught the winter light through the window, and she turned pages with the absorbed peace of a person exactly where she wants to be. Brennan had gone ahead. When they came through the gate at Ashenmere, the drive was clearer than she'd left it. Someone had been working on it, and she suspected Brennan had anticipated this return, in the same way he seemed to anticipate most things. The ivy on the western face of the house had the first reddish tinge of something living vigorously rather than simply persisting. The cracked gateposts stood on either side, and the headless one was still headless, and she was glad. She would leave it that way. Some ruins were more honest than restoration. She stepped out of the carriage onto the gravel, and the land came up through her feet with the full force of homecoming. It was different than it had been the first time. Deeper. Richer. The bond completion had changed the way she received it. Not louder exactly, more articulate, the way a language becomes when you finally stop translating and start thinking in it. She stood on her own ground and breathed, and the ground breathed back, and she felt it all. The 12 families in the estate and the outbuildings, the river running clear and high from recent rain, the old forest across the water where shapes still moved in the quiet, patient as the land itself. Aldrich came to stand beside her. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel him in the bond, the warm, steady presence of him, and she could feel the territory recognizing him. Not as its holder, she was that, but as belonging to the person who held it, which was something different and good. "It's bigger than I expected," he said. "It grows," she said, "when the ground knows who it belongs to." A beat. "Does it know?" he said. She looked at him then. The afternoon light on his face was the same gold as the light that had been on his face the day at the river, and his expression was the one she'd decided to keep. The open one, the real one, slightly undone. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crouched down, which was not something Alpha Kings did, in public or otherwise, and pressed his palm to the cold gravel. She watched him go very still, watched the moment the land found him. She felt it from her own side, the warmth directing itself toward his hand, the recognition flowing. He looked up at her from where he crouched. His expression had completed into something she had no name for, and she decided she didn't need one. It was his. "Yes," he said. She extended her hand to him. He took it and stood, and the land held them both on its cold, living ground under a winter sky that was already, in the far west, going the first tentative gold of a clear sunset. She had been sent away to disappear. She had become something no one had planned for instead, and now she stood on her own ground, chosen freely, with the man she'd unmade and remade and chosen back, and the land under her feet was breathing, and the packs were in the outbuildings, and the river was running, and the old forest was full of patient waiting shapes, and none of this had been given to her. She had built it from a ruin. That was the thing she would carry longest. Not the decree, not the hall with the averted eyes, not the cold carriage or the crumbling drive. This, the cold earth under her palms in the dark, the warmth that came up to meet her, the specific moment she'd understood that the land had not been waiting to save her. It had been waiting to recognize her. She looked at the estate, the house with its ivy and its missing window panes, and the kitchen light already warming in the late afternoon, and the people moving in and out of the door with the easy purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be. She looked at the sky going gold. She looked at the man beside her, whose hand was still in hers. She had been wolfless. She had been exiled. She had been dismissed from a hall where no one would meet her eyes, and sent to a ruin to become less than she was. She had become the ground instead. She squeezed his hand once, not a gesture of need, but of arrival. And then she turned and walked toward the house, and the land rose to meet every step,